Hello, over the course of these videos we've been dabbling in code, and some of those blocks of code have been fairly large. One was for the index lookup, and another in the last lesson was code that managed the QBF buttons. In this lesson I want to cover the debugger and how it can help developers to better debug their code quickly and efficiently. So we'll be right back after these few words. Hello, this is Martin and I'm back with another OpenInsight quick start guide video. Today we're going to be looking at the debugger and more importantly how you can debug your code. I'm doing this now because we've been working in a number of areas with code. Most recently we were working in some code to manipulate the QBF buttons. Previous videos we've been working on the lookup function, and it's the lookup function that I'm choosing for this video. It's largely going to be a theory lesson, so if you want to go and pause the video now and grab a cup of coffee, please feel free. And I have created this little window here, nothing special, it's just a couple of labels, a couple of controls, a button, and then two standard buttons that's created when you create a standard window. And on the lookup button we have got the following code. So it's a little block of code, and that's what we're going to be working on within this system. Now, one of the things that I do want to mention before we get any further is on the taskbar there is a rev engine, and if you run that up, this gives you a number of bits of information. So you've got the engine info, which gives you your serial number, the numbers of users that you're running, the universal driver, the network product, other information, which is quite useful. So if we just come out of there, it's also got the ability to start a log, which will log what's going on in OpenInsight as things change, so as events are run and windows are opened and things, it logs all of that information. So that's really useful if you've got a deployed system and something is going wrong but your user isn't capturing where it's going wrong and giving you any decent information. You can set the log running, log everything, and then you can go in and see where you were at or where the system was at when the system went wrong. And there's also a debugger button. Now if I click the debugger button, you'll notice that nothing has happened, and that's because the debugger is always reactive to OpenInsight. And what it wants to do is it wants to review the process that's running now, and then if it's gone wrong, obviously it will produce the debugger. Now we've asked it to run the debugger and it's sitting there waiting for us to do something. So if we just click on the IDE, for instance, then the debugger pops up. So let's just close that down for the moment and we'll come back to our code. Now, one of the first things to bear in mind when you're working with stored procedures or scripts in this case, if I just introduce a bug simply by doing a carriage return for CA instead of calc field, and then we do a compile, you can see down the bottom here a report of exactly what's gone on. So the compilation failed. It failed for the click event for the button lookup, so this is the control that we're working on, and the issue is on line 21. We've got an illegal statement of CA, so if we go and have a look at that, we can immediately see where the issue is and we can quickly correct that. And then if we do a right mouse click again on the tab at the top and a compile, this time the compiler runs through and everything is all okay. So when you are working with your programs and making changes, always do a compile, make sure that it's compiled. And the other thing to bear in mind is always make sure that you do a save or a save and close. I'm just going to do a save here. Otherwise, if you run the form, it will run the old code, not the new one. So it like compiles it and then it saves it away. So it's like a two-step thing. So with our code compiled correctly, let's look at how we would debug. Now I can put a debug statement anywhere in this code, wherever I want to. So I'm actually going to have one at the top here, but let's say for instance that all this code was fine and I had an issue when I got down to these if statements down here, for instance. I can simply add debug in there, so what we call a debug statement, and the program will run through to this point and then it will stop. So if I were to compile that code, then I get my note that there is a debug statement found in the code, and it's not good to deploy your system with debugs in. So my advice to you is, just before you save away your code for the final time, make sure that you don't have this debug statement warning here. And it's really nice that this is right in front of you when you're working. And another way of handling this that somebody told me about a few weeks ago, and this is out of the scope of this video because I don't quite understand it, but you can have a debug with a name, so like a username, and then the debug statement will only come into effect and launch the debugger if you're logged in as that user, and that way there is no chance that one of your users will hit the debugger, because as you'll see in a moment, it's not nice when the debugger comes up. So if we just do a compile and a save, go back to the form and we test run the form, when we go to the lookup, it will drop to the debugger. Okay, so it's actually got to the point in the program after the little window came up. So we ran through the program getting the lookup, and then when we put the selection in, that is the point where we hit the debug statement. So we haven't had to worry about stepping through everything else. We've simply dropped to the debugger as soon as we hit that debug statement where we start to look at the search criteria. Now I'm going to cover all these windows in just a moment, because what I want to do is come back into the code and I want to remove that debug statement, and I'm going to put it in at the top so we can work through the whole of this particular program. So again, we'll compile the code, make sure it's compiled, save it, go back to the form, test run, and this time when we hit the lookup button, we drop straight into the debugger. We haven't got the small window that we got a moment ago, because if we look at the code here, our source code, we've run through these declarations and then we've immediately hit the debug before we've done anything at all. It's hit it straight away. Right, so the interface. At the top we have the toolbar with the functionality and a row of buttons. We can open store procedures, inserts and handlers. We can step into and run the code. We can step over and add breakpoints and view and modify variables, etc, etc. Now I tend very rarely to use these buttons, so this is going to be a quick video. I'm not going to go into everything in any great detail, but what I find really useful when I'm coding things and I want to make sure I'm getting the right variables and things are working in the way that I expect them to, I just simply drop into here and use these windows. So within the windows we have our source code. This is the code that we are actually running, and you can see where we are in the code at any one time. We then have the call stack, so we can see we're in the clinic application on the click event for the button lookup, and we've run that click event. So that's our call stack. We can see what's going on. We then have our local variables down here, most of which are unassigned at this point because obviously we're working through the code. So the only two that we have assigned at the moment is the control class ID, which is push button, and the control ent ID, which is mtr.buttonLookup. So in other words, my form and then the button that we are working on, because OpenInsight knows that information. On the other side we have our system variables, and if we double click that, you can see all of the system variables that have been assigned into the system. And that could be quite useful because sometimes you might want to double check, for instance, the window that you're working on. So the window that we're working with is MTR. You might want to check out all sorts of other information which is available to you within the global variables. So just coming back to the source code here, you can either run, which will then continue to run through the code, and the debugger will stop and the code will just run, which wouldn't really make sense for us here. Or we can do a step into. So if we do a step into, on that particular line there, we're just going to insert logical. So we've only inserted the logical library or whatever that does. Basically makes stuff available to us that's at the system level to call. So there's nothing, no variables that have changed. We're going to set the parent at window. So at the moment down here, parent is unassigned. And if we do a step into, you'll now see that the parent is set to MTR. So we might want to check and make sure that our parent is the same as the at window, and it is. So if we'd set something incorrectly in here and these two don't match up, then you know you've got a problem. So this is where you've got your local and your global variables working together. So if we step into again, we now get the window come up because we have hit the return values equals dialog box, and it runs the MP index lookup patients at the window. So this gives us the window. So we can now make a selection. Let's take Milton Keynes and search, and then we return back into the debugger, and it stepped over into the next area. So now we have table, which is unassigned, and if we step into, we're going to assign the table. The rest of those variables are then going to be unassigned, so it just leaves those as a couple of quote marks. We're then going to open the dictionary, so again nothing to show there, and then it jumps through to where we set the val count to 4, so we can step into again and we see the val count. So I'm not going to step all the way through. You get the idea of stepping through, having a look at the global and the local variables being the important ones. And if we then find an issue, what I tend to do is I just hit run to run through the rest. Doesn't particularly matter about that. Close that down and go back to the code, make the change, run it again. So obviously make the change, compile, save, go back and go around the whole loop. When you're happy, make sure that you remove that debug statement, do a compile, a save, and then make sure that it's saved without any warnings and messages. And this time when we run and we click the lookup button, we're just going to get the functionality without the debug statement showing. So that's really the debugger. Really useful tool for debugging your code. I use it an awful lot, and it shows up all sorts of things. So that's the end of this lesson, and I'll see you on the next one. Not quite sure what the next one will be about, but I'll see you then. Take care. Bye bye.